mindset about what work is changing. But there's kind of an elephant in the room for me, and I want to get your take on it.
I love elephants, so I'm excited.
Real wages have been falling precipitously, and the distribution of wealth, particularly in the US, but fairly globally, is really out of whack, over the last 20 years. We've got new forms of employment emerging, like gig work, which feels like it doesn't offer any of these kind of essential protections for workers. Is that a factor in all this? Is this an apology for a decline in wages over a period of time? I have to ask.
No, I don't think it's an apology. I think it's as you look at each of these economic eras, there's different government regulation that came into being around it. I think the government has, because the information age sort of grew up out of the Reagan era and beyond, where we held up companies as being more effective, more valuable than the government, which was, in my mind, a big mistake. We never really regulated the information economy, and we're seeing, what's going on politically right now as a result of corporations effectively keeping government out of regulation of that industry. And that has created problems that, I'm hopeful we can get over, but right now it's pretty easy to be pretty cynical and say that, we may not as a species recover from the lack of government regulation of those industries, and the sort of holding up Silicon Valley as the best of humanity instead of just seeing it as creativity, which can go in 1,000 different directions. So I think when we look at the purpose economy, I think we're seeing, similarly, this is not, it's not effectively being regulated, and it's connected to those same things. So, I wrote in the book about, Uber, Airbnb, these things all come out of that same impulse around purpose and empowering people and enabling them to take more autonomy, more control of their lives, being out in the community more, sort of disintermediation. All those things are positive, but they're not being effectively regulated. And we're not addressing sort of underlying problems in the economy that really did emerge heavily in the sort of 80s, where we're just seeing such a separation of classes in our society. And I think if government doesn't get involved and play its role, these things will become massive problems, and they're already pretty damn big problems to begin with. So I don't see it as much as apology. I see it as fundamental failure of our society to recognize the importance of government, the importance of regulation, and that we can't just trust companies to do what is sort of in our broader thought of good. And I don't think we've figured out, if you think about Moore's law around sort of the acceleration and speed of processing and computing power, we've never figured out how to create a Moore's law speed for regulation. And therefore, everything's just completely out of date, and the problems are emerging and becoming really bad before government even has time to process and think about the role it wants to play. And there's so much ability to then use that information and that technology to distort the public perspective, our point of view on it, so that it's nearly impossible to build the political will to address these issues.
There's one question I really want to get at, and we focused on in the research report, and that is around what's HR's opportunity during crises or just in general around purpose. How do you see the role of HR in enabling organizations to achieve their purpose?
It's such an important question, and I think you have to really sort of look at what the role of HR has been historically. And I think even the name itself, like human resources, sort of speaks to, I think, the old model of how we thought about work, how we thought about the role of work in our lives, and the way we thought about management versus sort of employees. And I think in the past, the role of HR was around optimizing sort of output from a human resource and mitigating sort of liability from that resource, and sort of making sure there's always a bumper crop of new resources sort of coming in. And I think in the purpose economy, the role needs to shift pretty fundamentally from this idea of sort of control to much more about lifting up. It has to go to much more of a role of seeing people truly as human beings and looking at, how do we do mass personalization of the experience of work? How do we understand the psychology of work and what brings out the best in people? How do we sort of proactively play a role in making sure that we've built, cultures where there's a sense of belonging? How are we making sure we're hiring people who are truly aligned with the mission and purpose of the organization? How are we helping to build conversation internally that aligns people as a tribe? So I think and we've been doing this evolution over the last 20 years, but I think it really brings to the forefront the need to make that shift. And at the core of that, I think really is this idea of moving away from the idea of management and employees to human beings and human beings.
Yeah, and I think that gets at some of the work that Danny and I have been doing around, we've thought about it as responsive organizations, but basically organizations where it's not command and control, but it's really much more about pushing information and decision making down and relying on some basic principles of human decency, respect, and trust being primary of those for people to make good decisions.
I think that's right. I think there's a couple of things I would just sort of double down on. I think one, there is a need to enable people to process information differently. I think in the past, information was thought of as like, the equivalent of like coding, where it's like a command or information that needs to be digested. Whereas I think now it's an understanding of like there's a psychological change management process. So needing to help people process that, which often is through conversation. It's through doing work around identity. It's around doing work around what does this mean for me? So much more of an acknowledgement of that change management process versus just dissemination. And the thing that we found in our research that I thought was really interesting is that when we asked people who is responsible for your fulfillment primarily, people pretty overwhelmingly said they were responsible for their own fulfillment. And when we asked people like what their number one barrier to fulfillment at work was, their top answer was they were their own biggest barrier. And I think that fundamentally changes the way you think about the role of HR and management. If you assume that people are responsible for their own fulfillment and people see themselves as the greatest barrier, then your job is to help people remove their own barriers that they're creating for themselves, creating space for that, and helping them do what they need to do. Whereas the old model is let's engage people, let's have engagement happen to people. What we're hearing when you look at it from much more of a human-centered point of view is people are ready to own it and they see themselves as the barrier, and the role of management and HR is to help them sort of do that work.
Interesting.
There's a really interesting parallel there between what's going on in the learning segment as well, where that used to be about training, about
right.
This command and control, a transfer of knowledge to the employee. And now there's much more of an embracing of the L&D role to create a culture where learning happens rather than do learning.
No, and I think as CHR told me recently, it's just like you've got so many different needs and you can never anticipate those needs. So it is about building that culture. And a lot of people are talking about it like as a coaching culture, which is this idea of like continuous growth and learning and challenge. And that it has to be personalized to what people need in the moment, not even what they need yesterday.
Let's maybe bring that to what's happening right now. So obviously, there's focus on COVID. On purpose, with COVID as well as social justice movements and the like. So maybe kind of just starting first with you, how has your own work changed this year? And then we'll talk about what's happening with organizations.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, this year has been like, I feel guilty saying it, but it's been a great year just in the sense that, in the work that I'm doing, I'm getting to, work from home, so I'm spending a lot less time sort of dealing with commuting. I'm getting to spend more time with family, a lot less stress associated with that. And the work we're actually doing, helping people connect is so at the core of what's needed right now. And then to see, I think with Black Lives Matter becoming more and more sort of part of the dialogue of the nation, just, my values and what I care about being taken more and more seriously is just like music to my ears. So it's been a source of a lot of inspiration that way. I think the flip side of that would be the election, which I think has had the opposite effect, which has been very disheartening.
And then as you think about purpose, has it evolved this year? And if so, in what ways?
I think it's evolved. I mean, again, depending on like how the angle you're looking at, I think we've seen sort of the sense of people needing to take care of each other, taking care of family. There's been like much more of a focus on the sort of family unit part of purpose. I think the ability to take care of one's own health has become sort of very front and center. But I think there's been this general bigger trend, which is an acknowledgement of the psychology of work and the psychology of our lives, and being able to see people, in their home settings, realizing sort of the real world, like the influences of their lives from their health to their family, et cetera. There's been a major move of humanizing work. And I think that at the core, purpose is about humanizing work. And therefore, I feel like there's been this like incredible opening to have this. And I've seen so many companies talk about things they're doing now to have real dialogue in their company that a year ago wouldn't have been possible. They wouldn't have had the courage to do it. We've seen CEOs of major companies saying like, if you don't, align with our values, if you don't think Black Lives Matter is like a real thing, like maybe you don't belong here. It's really just interesting to see how much more courage CEOs have had in the last year. It's given them permission to lead more courageously.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things we mentioned in the report, we said, this year has given organizations a mandate with regard to purpose. You either walk the walk or you walk away. So effectively a litmus test for purpose. Do you think that's true, or how have you been thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, purpose is really broad. I think that's generally true. I think this is a time when there's like a lot less sort of interest in, purpose washing, a lot less interest in sort of just pure marketing. And there's a whole movement around sort of performative activity versus actually like doing things. There's a lot more skepticism, which I think brings that up. And there's been some interesting, research on the companies that, looked at redefining the purpose of a company and whether or not in these times of challenge and change they're doing that, or if they're sort of falling back to sort of more traditional models. I'd like to think the majority of organizations are sort of moving in the right direction. But then you have companies that I think where there's just a ton of gray area. I mean, you look at a lot of the companies in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of courage going on in a lot of different ways, but there's also a lot of just continuing to be part of the problem. And I think it is really hard, especially if all of your revenue is tied to behaviors that may not be as aligned with sort of the world we want to see.
Yeah. It's a great point, I think, between people not being as interested in purpose washing. And I think that that's being backed up by consumers. There was a study from Edelman, their trust barometer.
Sure.
They ran a version of that back in June. And they found that basically organizations wanted brands to lead, particularly when it came to social justice, and that if they weren't having their own house in order, that they would individuals would move away from purchasing those products. So I think really the strength behind, don't just, talk the talk, you really have to walk the walk.
And it's hard. I mean, I think it's a hard thing to show walking the walk, especially as a consumer to look at a company, because it's so hard to understand what's really going on there and to get beyond the marketing, which is why I shared before. I think it's so important to look at where companies are spending their lobbying money, because that really is the indicator whether or not they're walking the walk, and looking at how people are treating their people. Everything else is like, it's really hard to discern what's real and what's not.
I think one of the things that we're seeing right now in real time is that, companies are having to make tough decisions around hiring and furloughing and laying off people just because of the hard economics of how you run a company. And I wonder if that will tarnish this sort of trend.
Oh, it's so hard. I think the early relief that was given by the federal government to help people and help certain industries really helped address a lot of that in the short term. But now that that's sort of behind us, we are seeing an awful lot of that. And, seeing the airlines doing major layoffs, I think we're going to see a lot of layoffs this, fourth quarter of 2020. And it is, how you do that, I think makes a big difference. And, I haven't read how well it worked, but I did like what Airbnb did, where they actually basically tried to help people get hired by, enabling employees to post that they're looking, and putting recommendations for them, recognizing they weren't laying off people based on performance, and that there were a lot of great people they had to let go. So I think the more companies can do to visibly support their folks in an authentic way is going to make a big difference for their brand.
Question here on the future of how we contract for our labor. Is purpose as a concept, is it better tied to sort of entrepreneurial work than corporate work? Or do you see it equally useful in both environments?
I don't know if that distinction is as important as just level of autonomy within work. And I think that when you don't have any autonomy, it's harder to find a sense of purpose because you have less sense of control and less ability to tailor it to what matters to you versus, when you have a high level of autonomy, you have a lot of ability to craft your work to really align with what matters to you. I think if you think about purpose in the broadest sense, the resources that a larger organization can bring to bear can do a lot to make it much easier to have a sense of purpose. Whereas a startup, which can be completely overwhelming, and just, under-resourced, and you're just trying to stay alive. I think there's a sense of being sort of constantly in the state of high anxiety, high purpose in a startup, just because, every day is a battle. But I think that also can lead to a lot of burnout, and it's not always the type of purpose that is healthy in the long run. And having been in startups basically my whole career, I think there's it's sprints, it's not a marathon, and that's not always the best.
Just as you think about talent leaders, going back to who I started with a moment ago, what kind of advice would you have for them regarding purpose alignment? Especially right now, given everything that we just discussed.
I think my top advice would be to create space for your people to truly have human conversations and human relationships, because that is at the core what's going to enable the right ideas to come forward, the confidence and the right mindset to adapt and to change. That need for human connection, like